Welcome back. Tonight, we are not tracing the timeline of Five Nights at Freddy's. We are not going to walk you through who killed whom, which animatronic houses which soul, or try to settle the decades-old debate about bytes and dates, and which purple figure stands where in the grand chain of events. No, tonight we are doing something different. We are going behind the curtain. We are stepping into the workshop where this entire machine was built, examining the gears and pulleys and strange little mechanisms that make Five Nights at Freddy's lore one of the most fascinating storytelling experiments in modern entertainment. Because what makes this franchise so endlessly captivating is not simply what the story says. It is how the story is told, and more importantly, how it was built, piece by piece, across more than a decade of games, our books, movies, community interaction, and the brilliant, sometimes maddening decisions of one independent game developer from Texas who turned a failed beaver game into a global horror phenomenon. Think about this for a moment. Five Nights at Freddy's began as a solo project built in ClickTeam Fusion by a man who had never made a horror game before. It had no cutscenes, no voice-acted dialogue outside of a few phone calls, no written narrative you could read from beginning to end. And yet, it spawned one of the most complex, debated, and passionately followed storylines in the history of video games. The lore of this franchise has filled more than 40 books, inspired thousands of theory videos with hundreds of millions of collective views, produced 2 feature films, and kept a global community of detectives guessing and arguing for over 10 years. How does something like that happen? How does a story with no narrator, no clear beginning or end, no definitive answers to half of its biggest questions still command this level of devotion? That is what we are here to explore tonight. Not the what, but the how. We are going to examine the methods, the philosophy, the accidents, and the genius behind the way Five Nights at Freddy's delivers its narrative. We will look at how environmental storytelling replaced traditional exposition, how the community itself became a co-author of the lore through a feedback loop that influenced the direction of future games, how retcons, far from being mistakes, became a deliberate tool in the franchise's evolving mythology, how the book series exists in a strange liminal space between canon and parallel universe, offering answers that are both true and not quite true at the same time. How the transition from a solo developer to a studio collaboration changed everything about the way FNAF stories are delivered. How Scott Cawthon turned his own website into a narrative device, and how all of these elements combine into a storytelling engine that is unlike anything else in gaming. Whether you are a long-time follower of this franchise who has watched every theory video and read every book, someone who has always been curious about how this sprawling narrative actually functions underneath the surface, or someone simply drifting into sleep while the details wash over you like a fog, settle in. And this is going to be a long and winding journey through the machinery behind the mystery. We will take our time with each piece, turning it over in the light, examining the connections, and appreciating just how extraordinary this whole experiment really is. Before we get started, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy this kind of slow, deep exploration of how stories work. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is one of the quiet pleasures of this channel, knowing that the same words are drifting through different rooms in different corners of the world, all at once. Let us begin. To understand how Five Nights at Freddy's lore actually works, you have to start before the lore existed at all. You have to go back to a time when Scott Cawthon was not a horror icon. He was not the architect of a multimedia empire built on haunted animatronics and murdered children. He was a struggling independent game developer in Texas, a man of deep Christian faith who had spent years making family-friendly games with modest ambitions and even more modest commercial returns. Titles like The Pilgrim's Progress, a side-scroller based on the classic Christian allegory, Sit and Survive, a simple mobile game, The Desolate Hope, a surprisingly ambitious RPG that showed flashes of the atmospheric talent lurking beneath the surface. These games were earnest, creative, and largely ignored by the wider gaming world. Cawthon kept making them, funding his life through odd jobs and the thin revenue of mobile sales, driven by the belief that somewhere in his work there was something worth finding. And then came Chipper & Sons Lumber Company in 2013. This was supposed to be his breakthrough, a family-friendly resource management game starring Tyke, a young beaver helping his father run a lumber business. You chopped trees, sold wood, upgraded your operation, and interacted with a cast of cartoon animal characters rendered in Cawthon's signature 3D style. He submitted it to Steam Greenlight, the platform's community-driven approval system at the time, hoping to reach a wider audience. The reception was devastating. Players and reviewers tore into the game's visuals. The characters, intended to be friendly and appealing, were described as unsettling. They looked, critics said, like creepy animatronic animals. The 3D models had a stiffness to them, and an uncanny quality that made the cartoon beavers and squirrels seem less like charming mascots and more like the kind of mechanical figures you might see jerking to life in the back room of a defunct Chuck E. Cheese. One particularly harsh review compared the characters directly to frightening animatronics, and that phrasing stuck. The criticism broke something in Cawthon, not just professionally, but personally. He had been making games for years, pouring his creative energy into projects that never quite connected. Chipper & Sons was supposed to be different. It was polished, ambitious, a proper attempt at a Steam release, and the world told him it was creepy, that his art looked wrong, that the friendly faces he had crafted looked like something from a nightmare. In his own words, he entered a period of deep depression. He questioned whether he had wasted his life pursuing game development. He considered abandoning the profession entirely. His financial situation deteriorated. And in one of the darkest moments, his life insurance policy was cancelled after the company learned he had expressed thoughts of self-harm to his doctor. As he later described, even his death seemed to have no value. But something shifted. In the wreckage of that failure, Cawthon found an idea. If the world thought his characters looked like creepy animatronics, then he would make a game about creepy animatronics. He would lean into the very quality that had been used to mock him. He would take the uncanny stiffness of his 3D models, the hollow-eyed stare, the mechanical unnaturalness that audiences found so disturbing, and he would make those qualities the entire point. He would build a world where the wrongness was intentional, where the audience was supposed to feel unsettled, where the gap between friendly mascot and lurking predator was the source of all the horror. This is the origin of Five Nights at Freddy's, and it matters enormously to understanding how the lore works. Because this franchise was not born from a grand narrative vision. It was not planned as a 10-game, 40-book saga from the start. It emerged from a creative pivot, a moment of artistic desperation, where a struggling developer took the worst criticism he had ever received and transformed it into the foundation of something extraordinary. The first game was conceived as a standalone experience, a last-ditch effort at commercial viability, and that fact that there was no master plan, a no Bible of lore sitting in a desk drawer waiting to be revealed, is the single most important thing to understand about how this story was built. Everything that followed grew organically, reactively, and sometimes chaotically from this single accidental beginning. The lore of Five Nights at Freddy's is not a blueprint that was executed. It is a living structure that was constructed in real time, one floor at a time, sometimes without knowing what the next floor would look like until the current one was finished. Cawthon submitted Five Nights at Freddy's to Steam Greenlight in the summer of 2014, alongside a release on Desura and a demo on IndieDB. He built it alone, using ClickTeam Fusion for the game engine and Autodesk 3ds Max for his 3D character models. The budget was effectively zero beyond his time and existing tools. He did not hire voice actors for elaborate cutscenes. He did not write a script with branching dialogue trees. He did not create a world map or a timeline document or any of the conventional apparatus of narrative game design. What he created instead was something far more unusual. He created a game where the story was hidden, not told, hidden. And that decision, born as much from budget constraints as from creative instinct, would become the defining characteristic of the entire franchise's approach to storytelling. When Five Nights at Freddy's launched on August 8, 2014, players found themselves sitting in a small security office, staring at a bank of grainy camera monitors with two heavy metal doors on either side and a limited supply of electrical power to get through the night. That was it. No opening cinematic explaining the world. No text crawl establishing the history of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. No tutorial level with a guide character walking you through the narrative stakes. You were a night guard named Mike Schmidt. You had a job. The animatronics moved at night. Survive until 6 in the morning. The genius of this setup is in what it does not give you. Traditional horror games, even indie ones, typically provide some kind of narrative scaffolding. A journal entry explaining why the protagonist is here. A cutscene showing the inciting incident. Environmental audio logs or readable documents that lay out the backstory in neat, digestible chunks. Five Nights at Freddy's offers almost none of this. What it offers instead is a phone. Specifically, a series of pre-recorded phone calls from a previous security guard known only as Phone Guy and voiced by Scott Cawthon himself. These calls serve a dual purpose that is easy to miss on first encounter. On the surface, they are gameplay tutorials. Phone Guy tells you about the animatronics, their movement patterns, how to use the doors and lights, how to manage your power. He is friendly, a little awkward, casually professional in the way of someone who has grown so accustomed to a bizarre situation that they no longer recognize how bizarre it actually is. But woven into this practical guidance are fragments of something larger. Phone Guy mentions that the animatronics have been acting strangely. He alludes to a previous incident, the bite of 87, in which an animatronic bit someone's frontal lobe during the day shift. He tells you that the animatronics are allowed to walk around at night to prevent their servos from locking up. A company-mandated explanation that feels rehearsed and insufficient. He warns that if an animatronic catches you, it will try to stuff you into a mechanical suit, and the result would be unpleasant because of the endoskeleton parts inside. The crossbeams, the wires, the servo mechanisms. He phrases it delicately, clinically, as though reading from a liability disclaimer. But the implication is graphic and horrifying. None of this is delivered as exposition. It arrives as workplace small talk, as the kind of thing a bored co-worker might say while showing you the ropes on your first day. And that is the key to understanding FNAF's first and most fundamental storytelling technique. The information is always present, but never presented. It is buried in the casual, the incidental, at the things that seem like background noise until you start paying attention. Beyond the phone calls, the first game plants its lore in the environment itself. Newspaper clippings appear on the walls as rare, randomized events. They are easy to miss entirely if you are focused on surviving the night. But if you happen to notice them and manage to read the text, they reveal an entirely different dimension of the world. Children have gone missing at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. 2 children were reported missing, then 5. The bodies were never found. A man was eventually arrested and charged with the crimes, but the evidence was largely circumstantial, and the suits were never examined despite reports of blood and a foul smell emanating from the animatronics. The restaurant struggled on, its reputation damaged, its mascot stained with an odor no amount of cleaning could remove. These newspaper clippings transformed the entire game. Without them, Five Nights at Freddy's is a straightforward survival horror game with a creepy premise. With them, it becomes something else entirely. A haunted place, a crime scene, a monument to a tragedy that nobody wanted to acknowledge, where the victims might still be present in some form, trapped inside the very machines that entertain children during the day. The clippings do not spell this out. They do not say the animatronics are possessed. They simply lay the evidence before you and let you draw the connection yourself. And that act of inference, that moment where the player's mind bridges the gap between the clue and the conclusion, is where the real storytelling happens. And this is environmental storytelling at its most potent. Instead of telling the player what happened, the game creates an environment saturated with evidence and lets the player become a detective. Every detail becomes potentially significant. The handprint on Freddy Fazbear's face. Is that a design choice? Or is that the mark of a child who fought against being stuffed inside? The kitchen camera that shows audio but no video. Is that a broken feed? Or is something in there that the game does not want you to see? The fan sitting on the desk in the security office. Why is it there? Why does it never turn off? Why is it one of the only things that remains constant across every night? Even the fan, an object with absolutely no narrative significance, became the subject of intense community analysis simply because the game trained players to treat everything as a potential clue. And that is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the architecture of Five Nights at Freddy's narrative design. It teaches the audience how to engage with it. By hiding the story so thoroughly, by making every piece of lore feel like a discovery rather than a delivery, the game conditions its players to scrutinize everything, to slow down the audio recordings and listen for hidden messages, to brighten screenshots and examine corners, to cross-reference details between cameras and nights and patches and updates. The game does not just tell a story. It creates an audience that is obsessed with finding the story. And that obsession, that trained behavior of relentless investigation, lies the engine that would power the entire franchise forward for over a decade. Consider the hidden audio on night 5 of the first game. If you reverse the garbled message that plays during the phone call and clean up the distortion, what emerges is something utterly unexpected. The community's prevailing interpretation, based on careful analysis of the reversed and pitch-corrected audio, is that it contains a passage from Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhansa Yogananda, a spiritual text about agricultural mechanisms and scientific instruments, a passage about plant growth and the marvels of technology, recited in a halting, distorted voice over a backdrop of garbled interference. Why Cawthon chose this particular text has never been confirmed, though some fans have noted that the chapter in question discusses experiments depicting metal as a kind of living organism, a theme that resonates deeply with a franchise about souls trapped in mechanical bodies. This was not mentioned in any marketing material. It was not pointed out by a tutorial prompt. It was buried so deep that only players who thought to record the audio, reverse it, clean it up, and listen carefully would ever find it. And when they did find it, when they shared their discovery on forums and Reddit and YouTube, it sent shockwaves through the community, not because the content provided a straightforward answer, but because its very obscurity confirmed something crucial about the game's design philosophy. There are secrets here, real secrets. And if this one was hidden this deeply, what else might be waiting in the dark? That question, what else is hidden, became the beating heart of the franchise. It is the question that launched 1,000 theory videos. It is the question that kept players returning to games they had already beaten, scrutinizing screenshots they had already examined, debating details they had already discussed. It is the question that made Five Nights at Freddy's not just a game to play, but a puzzle to solve. And it all started with a single design choice. Do not tell the story. Hide it. Let the audience come and find it. Make the discovery feel earned. Make it feel like a secret. And they will keep looking forever. The Night 5 phone call in the original game deserves special attention as a narrative device. By this point in the game, your phone guy's messages have grown progressively shorter and more strained. The casual professionalism of Night 1 has given way to genuine unease by Night 3. And by Night 4, the call is interrupted by what sounds like an animatronic attack. Banging on doors, the winding music box faltering, the Toreador march playing in the background. Phone guy's final words are cut short, and the implication is unmistakable. He did not survive his shift. Night 5's call is garbled, distorted, inhuman. And then you are alone. No guide, no friendly voice. Just the cameras, the doors, and the things walking in the dark. This progression does something extraordinary with player psychology. It establishes Phone Guy as a character you grow attached to, not through dramatic storytelling, but through the simple familiarity of hearing his voice at the start of every shift. He becomes your companion, your tether to normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. And then he is taken away. His loss is not a cutscene. It is an absence, a silence where there used to be a voice. And that silence communicates the danger more effectively than any scripted death scene ever could. The game teaches you to fear through what it removes, not what it shows. This principle of absence as horror extends to every corner of the first game's design. You never see the murders. You never see the children. You never see inside the suits. You are given fragments, implications, negative space, and your imagination fills in the rest with something far more disturbing than any explicit depiction could provide. And this is the foundation upon which the entire franchise was built. Not a story told, but a story hidden. Not answers provided, but questions raised. Not a narrative consumed, but a narrative constructed, collaboratively, between the creator who hid the pieces and the audience who found them. And that collaborative construction, that relationship between Scott Cawthon and his community, would become the most important element of the franchise's storytelling apparatus as the series grew beyond anything anyone, including its creator, could have imagined. When Five Nights at Freddy's exploded in popularity in the late summer and fall of 2014, driven largely by YouTube Let's Play videos from creators like Markiplier, PewDiePie, and Jacksepticeye. Something unexpected happened. The community did not just play the game. They dissected it. Within days of release, forums were flooded with theories. Reddit threads stretched into hundreds of comments debating the significance of the newspaper clippings, the identity of Phone Guy, the meaning behind the animatronic's behavior, and whether the bite of 87 was the central mystery of the game, or merely one thread in a larger story. Players brightened screenshots to examine hidden details in the background. They isolated audio files and ran them through spectral analysis software. They mapped the restaurant layout from the camera feeds and cross-referenced it with the game's internal code. This was not normal player behavior for an indie horror game. This was forensic investigation, and Scott Cawthon was watching. This is the moment where the Five Nights at Freddy's storytelling model diverges most dramatically from anything else in gaming. Because rather than simply observing the community's obsession from a distance, Cawthon entered into a dialogue with it. Not a direct dialogue, not in the sense of posting definitive answers on forums, but a creative dialogue where the community's theories and passions visibly influence the direction of future games. The relationship between Cawthon and his audience became a feedback loop, and that loop became the primary engine driving the franchise's narrative evolution. Consider the speed at which Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was produced. The first game released on August 8, 2014. The sequel released on November 10th of the same year. 3 months. In an industry where development cycles regularly stretch across years, Cawthon delivered a fully realized sequel in 90 days. And that sequel was not a simple rehash. It was a prequel, set before the events of the first game, introducing an entirely new cast of animatronics, the toy versions, alongside the decayed originals now classified as withered. It added the puppet, a character who would become one of the most important figures in the entire mythology. It introduced Purple Guy through its minigames, the first visual depiction of the series' central villain. It contained new lore delivered through phone calls from a different era, setting the story in 1987 and recontextualizing everything players thought they knew about the first game. This sequel was not created in a vacuum. It was created in response to the community. Cawthon saw how passionately players engaged with the mystery of the first game. He saw the theories, the debates, the hunger for more information. And he gave them more, but in characteristic fashion, he gave them more questions along with their answers. For every mystery the second game resolved, it introduced 2 new ones. Who is Purple Guy? Why does the puppet seem to give life to the other animatronics? What is the connection between the toy animatronics and the old ones? Why is the building so different? What really happened in 1987? The bite of 87 was mentioned in the first game as a historical footnote. In the second game, it became a looming threat, an event that players believed they might be able to witness or prevent, and Cawthon let them believe that. He let the mystery build. He fed the machine. The community's response was immediate and volcanic. MatPat, the host of the massively popular YouTube channel Game Theory, had already created theory videos about the first game. With the release of Five Nights at Freddy's 2, FNAF became a permanent fixture on his channel. Over the next several years, MatPat would produce dozens upon dozens of videos about the franchise, with estimates placing the total well above 60 across his various channels, each one attracting millions of views, each one building on the last, each one creating new debates and drawing new viewers into the community's investigative culture. His early theories, including the claim that Phone Guy was Purple Guy, would later be proven incorrect, but that did not matter. What mattered was the process, the act of theorizing, of marshalling evidence, and of constructing arguments and defending them against counter-theories. MatPat gave the community a framework for engaging with the law. He turned the detective work from a casual hobby into a spectacle, and the spectacle drew in millions. Cawthon's relationship with this theorizing community was complex and deliberately ambiguous. He rarely confirmed or denied specific theories. When he did engage, it was often through oblique comments that raised as many questions as they answered. But there were moments of genuine interaction that shaped the franchise's direction. The most significant came in November 2017, when MatPat released a 2-part video that attempted to create a definitive timeline for the series. Cawthon responded on Reddit with an extraordinary comment. He wrote that some of the contentious issues in the community had the debates about 1983 versus 1987, about whether Michael Afton or William Afton was Springtrap, about the nature of the Purple Guy's coloring, had been simple misunderstandings or things he had not left enough clues about. He praised MatPat's theory as not 100% correct, but said it hit the video out of the park. He confirmed that William Afton was Springtrap, that the bite in Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was the bite of 83 rather than the bite of 87, and he addressed the long-debated question of the Purple Guy's coloring, acknowledging that the community's confusion over whether the character was literally purple-skinned or whether the sprite color was a stylistic choice had been a misunderstanding he had not left enough clues to prevent. This single Reddit comment resolved debates that had raged for years, but more importantly, it revealed something about Cawthon's storytelling process. He admitted that he had been considering making a 6th game specifically to clarify law points that had confused the community. Now that MatPat's video had addressed many of those points, he felt freed from that obligation. This is an astonishing admission. The creator of the franchise was considering making an entire game, not to advance the story, but to fix the community's understanding of it. That is how deeply the feedback loop ran. The community's interpretation of the law was not just a side effect of the storytelling. It was a factor in the storytelling decisions themselves. When the community misunderstood something, Cawthon felt compelled to address it. When a theorist got something right, it relieved that compulsion. The audience was not passively receiving a story. They were actively shaping the conditions under which the next chapter would be written. This feedback loop created a unique creative dynamic. Cawthon would release a game filled with cryptic clues. The community would theorize. Cawthon would observe which theories gained traction, which contradictions emerged, which questions burned hottest. Then he would create the next game, partly to continue his intended narrative, and partly to respond to the community's engagement with the previous one. It was an iterative process, more like an ongoing conversation than a traditional narrative arc. And because the community's theories were often wildly creative and occasionally more interesting than Cawthon's original intentions, and this dialogue sometimes pulled the story in directions that even its creator had not anticipated. The mystery box was always partly filled by the audience's imagination. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's was not authored by one person. It was co-authored by a creator and a community, each feeding the other, each pushing the other to go deeper, each transforming the other's contributions into something neither could have produced alone. This dynamic also explains why the lore can feel simultaneously intentional and chaotic. There are moments of brilliant foreshadowing that span multiple games, details planted in an early title that only become meaningful years later. And there are moments where the pieces do not quite fit, where timelines contradict, where a character's role seems to shift between installments, and both are products of the same process. The intentional moments come from Cawthon's planning and creative vision. The inconsistencies come from the organic, reactive nature of a story being built in dialogue with millions of people. This is not a flaw in the franchise's design. It is the franchise's design. The messiness is inseparable from the magic. You cannot have one without the other. And the community, for the most part, embraces this. The unsolved mysteries, the contradictions, the unresolved threads are not sources of frustration for most FNAF fans. They are the fuel that keeps the conversation going. The day every question is answered is the day the discussion ends, and nobody wants that. Least of all, Scott Cawthon. One of the most discussed and least understood aspects of Five Nights at Freddy's storytelling is the retcon. The word retcon, short for retroactive continuity, describes the practice of altering previously established facts in a fictional narrative to accommodate new story developments. In most fandoms, retcons are viewed negatively. They are seen as admissions of poor planning, as evidence that the creator did not know where the story was going and had to rewrite the past to make the present work. But in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, retcons occupy a much more interesting position. They are not failures of the storytelling process. They are integral to it. They are, in a very real sense, one of the tools that Scott Cawthon uses to keep the narrative alive and evolving. The most illuminating example of this comes from the infamous box. At the end of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, released in July 2015, and players who completed the game were presented with an image of a locked chest. This was, implicitly, the box that contained the answers, the final piece of the puzzle, the key to everything. The community went wild trying to figure out how to open it. They searched the game's code, manipulated files, attempted every conceivable sequence of inputs. Nothing worked. The box could not be opened. And then Cawthon made a statement on Reddit that sent shockwaves through the fandom. He said that MatPat's theory at the time was absolutely right, confirming whatever that theory happened to contain. But then he added something extraordinary. He said that the contents of the box had changed over the years. The things that were meant to be inside the box when he first created it were not the same things that would be inside it now, because the story had evolved. Stop and think about what that means. The definitive answers to the franchise's deepest mysteries were not fixed. They were not written in stone when the game launched. They changed as the story grew. The box was not a sealed vault containing eternal truths. It was a living container whose contents shifted to accommodate the narrative's ongoing development. This is retconning not as a mistake, but as a method. It is Cawthon acknowledging openly and without shame that his story was not set in stone from the beginning, that it grew and changed as new games were made, as new ideas emerged, as the community's engagement revealed which threads were worth pursuing and which were dead ends. Another revealing example involves the design of Toy Chica in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, and this animatronic is depicted with a removable beak that disappears during her more aggressive phases. During the Historic Game Theory livestream in September 2015, Cawthon posed a provocative question to the assembled theorists. In the Five Nights at Freddy's 4 minigames, why would the tiny Toy Chica figure be missing her beak? This question assigned narrative meaning to the design detail, implying it was a deliberate lore clue worth investigating. The community seized on it as confirmation that the missing beak held hidden significance. But then, When Darko interviewed Cawthon in 2018, Cawthon said the design choice was purely aesthetic. The missing beak was just to make her look more creepy and uncomfortable, nothing more. This directly contradicted the implications of his earlier hint. Either the meaning was always there and he later downplayed it, or the meaning was retroactively applied during the 2015 livestream after the community started searching for it, and his 2018 answer reflected the original intent. Both possibilities are interesting, and both illustrate the same fundamental principle. In the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, meaning is not always predetermined. Sometimes it is assigned after the fact. Sometimes a design choice that began as aesthetic becomes narratively significant because the community started treating it as significant. This blurring of the line between intended meaning and discovered meaning is one of the most unusual features of the franchise's storytelling. It creates a world where anything could be a clue, not because everything was designed as a clue, but because the act of community investigation can transform any detail into one. This approach has what some observers might call disastrous implications for the theorizing community, because it means you can never be entirely sure whether you are uncovering a planted clue or reading meaning into a random design choice. But it also has profoundly liberating implications, because it means the act of theorizing itself has genuine creative power. When the community latches onto a detail and builds a theory around it, that theory sometimes enters the creator's awareness and influences the next installment. The community's interpretation can retroactively become canon. This is not conventional storytelling. This is collaborative mythology building, where the line between creator and audience, between text and interpretation, becomes genuinely blurry. The mic trap debate offers perhaps the clearest window into how retcons function in the franchise. After the release of Five Nights at Freddy's sister location in 2016 and its custom night update, a fierce debate erupted over whether the character inside Springtrap was William Afton, the series' established villain, or his son Michael Afton, who had undergone his own transformation during sister location's events. The evidence seemed to support the Michael interpretation. A robotic-sounding voice in Michael's monologue, combined with visual similarities between his deteriorated form and Springtrap's appearance, led many to conclude that Mic Trap was the intended reading. The community was genuinely divided, with passionate advocates on both sides producing elaborate evidence compilations and counter-arguments. How when Cawthon finally weighed in through his comment on MapPat's theory video, he confirmed that William was Springtrap. He also clarified that the robotic quality of Michael's voice in the sister location monologue was an unintended side effect of him slowing down the audio for dramatic effect. It was not meant to sound robotic at all. This is an important moment because it shows the gap between creator intent and community interpretation. The community heard a robotic voice and constructed a theory around it. Cawthon intended a dramatic pause and accidentally created something that sounded mechanical. The entire mic trap debate, which consumed months of community discourse, was built on a misinterpretation of an audio processing choice. But here is the fascinating part. Even as Cawthon denied mic trap, and there was a period where the theory seemed plausible enough that many believed it was the intended direction, and if Cawthon had chosen to lean into that reading rather than correct it, it could have become canon through acceptance rather than design. The fact that he chose to course correct tells us something about his boundaries. He was willing to let meaning shift. He was willing to let the box's contents change, but he was not willing to let the central villain of his story be accidentally replaced by a different character through community misinterpretation. There are limits to the flexibility, but those limits are much wider than in most fictional universes. The 1983 versus 1987 debate provides another illuminating case. Five Nights at Freddy's 4, subtitled The Final Chapter, and depicted a child being fatally bitten by the Fredbear animatronic. The community immediately began debating whether this was the bite of 87, the incident referenced in the first game's phone calls, or a different event set in 1983, as suggested by a television screen in the game showing the Fredbear and Friends show with a 1983 copyright date. This debate raged for over 2 years. Both sides had compelling evidence. Both sides were passionate. And the resolution, when it finally came through Cawthon's Reddit confirmation, was that the game depicted the bite of 83, a separate event from the bite of 87. The bite of 87 remained unseen, its perpetrator unconfirmed, though hints pointed toward the toy animatronics in the second game. What this debate reveals is that Cawthon deliberately created an ambiguity and then let it ferment. He included the 1983 television screen, knowing it would conflict with the community's assumption that they were witnessing the bite of 87. He planted the contradiction and stepped back to watch what happened. Whether this was a planned misdirection or a late addition that complicated an originally simpler narrative is impossible to know for certain. But the result was 2 years of passionate engagement with a single question. Engagement that kept the community active and invested between game releases. The ambiguity was not a mistake. It was fuel. This understanding of retcons as fuel rather than failure is essential to appreciating how the Five Nights at Freddy's storytelling machine operates. Every contradiction is a conversation starter. Every unresolved question is an invitation to speculate. And every shift in established facts is a reminder that the story is still alive, still growing, still capable of surprising you even when you think you have figured it all out. Most fictional universes punish inconsistency. The FNAF universe thrives on it. The lore is not a fixed document to be decoded. It is a living organism to be observed, and it changes as it grows. If phone calls are the voice of Five Nights at Freddy's and environmental details are its body language, then minigames are its dreams. Starting with Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Cawthon introduced a storytelling device that would become one of the most distinctive and influential elements of the entire franchise. Small, pixelated, 8-bit style minigames that appear between nights, or are triggered by specific actions during gameplay. These minigames look almost primitive, are deliberately styled after early arcade games or Atari-era graphics, with simple color palettes and blocky character sprites. They feel like fragments of a fever dream, disconnected from the polished 3D environments of the main game. And they contain some of the most critical lore in the entire series. The first set of major minigames appeared in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, and they introduced the community to a visual language that would persist across multiple games. The Give Gifts, Give Life minigame depicted the puppet moving between the bodies of 4 dead children and placing animatronic masks on them. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and then a 5th child, seated separately, who receives no mask, but instead triggers a jump scare from what appears to be Golden Freddy. This single minigame, lasting perhaps 15 seconds, and communicated more about the franchise's core mythology than entire games' worth of phone calls and newspaper clippings combined. The children were murdered. The puppet gave them new life by binding their souls to the animatronic suits. And one child, the 5th, exists in a different state. Unbound, incomplete, lingering. In 15 seconds of pixel art, the central mechanism of the FNAF universe was revealed. But the brilliance of the minigame delivery system is in how these revelations were accessed. They were not mandatory. They did not play automatically at the end of each night. Some were triggered by specific deaths, requiring the player to die in particular ways or at particular moments. Others required precise actions during gameplay, like navigating to certain cameras or clicking on hidden elements at exact moments. Some could only be accessed on specific nights. Some appeared to be glitches, their pixel art interrupting the main game like corrupted data bleeding through a damaged hard drive. This presentation transformed each minigame from a simple story beat into a reward for investigation, a secret uncovered by the persistent and the observant. If you were not looking for them, you would miss them entirely. The game would present a complete experience without them. But if you found them, the experience expanded into something vastly deeper and more disturbing. The Save Them minigame in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is a perfect illustration of this principle. Triggered by a death during specific conditions, it places the player in control of the withered Freddy animatronic, navigating a top-down map of the restaurant, and scattered throughout the corridors are the bodies of 5 children, depicted as crude colored shapes against the floor. A purple figure appears, blocking the path, uttering the words, "You can't." And then the minigame crashes. This was the community's first clear visual depiction of the purple guy, the figure who would eventually be identified as William Afton. And it was delivered through a medium that felt broken, corrupted, like a memory the game itself was trying to suppress. The aesthetic of the minigame reinforced its content. The story of these murders was not something the game wanted to tell you. It was something the game was leaking, involuntarily, through cracks in its digital surface. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 expanded the minigame system dramatically. The game's post-night minigames told a sequential story across multiple playthroughs. In one path, players controlled various animatronics following a shadowy figure through the corridors toward a sealed room, only to be dismantled one by a purple character wielding a tool. In the good ending path, players guided the spirits through a more elaborate series of cake-themed minigames, culminating in a scene where 5 children sat at a birthday table, finally at peace, while their masks fell away and they moved on. This was the happiest day minigame, one of the most emotionally powerful moments in the franchise, and it was entirely missable. If you did not complete the specific sequence of actions required to unlock the good ending minigames, you would never see it. The game was perfectly playable without it, but for those who found it, it provided something the franchise almost never offers: a moment of genuine catharsis, a moment where the story stopped being about hidden horrors and became about release and resolution. The minigame in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 that depicted Purple Guy's demise is equally significant. After luring the animatronics to the safe room and dismantling them, the purple figure is confronted by the ghosts of the children. He retreats into the Spring Bonnie suit, laughing, believing himself safe. And then the spring locks fail. The suit clamps down. The purple figure slumps to the ground, and fluid pools beneath the sprite. This is the origin of Springtrap, one of the most important events in the entire franchise, and it was told through a minigame that lasts perhaps 30 seconds. No dialogue, no explanation, just simple animation, color, and movement, communicating a complex sequence of events, motivation, irony, and consequence through pure visual storytelling. The effectiveness of these minigames as storytelling devices stems from several intersecting qualities. Their simplicity strips away everything extraneous, forcing each element to carry maximum narrative weight. A colored sprite moving toward a door is not just a game mechanic. It is a child walking toward their death. A mask placed on a body is not just a pixel animation. It is a soul being bound to a prison of metal and wire. The abstraction of the art style allows the player's imagination to fill in the details that the graphics cannot provide. And as we discussed earlier, the imagined version is always more powerful than the depicted one. Their accessibility creates a community of discoverers. Because the minigames are hidden and must be earned through specific actions, finding one feels like uncovering a buried artifact. Players who discovered them became evangelists, sharing their findings on forums and video platforms, contributing to the collective investigation. Each minigame discovery was a community event, a moment when the veil was briefly pulled back and new information flooded in, triggering waves of analysis and theory. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 shifted the minigame approach slightly, using between-night sequences that played automatically and depicted the week leading up to the crying child's birthday party. These were more structured, more linear, more explicitly narrative than the hidden minigames of previous titles. They showed the bullying, the fear, the plushies that seemed to speak with a father's voice, the masks worn by cruel older brothers, and ultimately the fatal bite. This shift toward more accessible minigame storytelling reflected the increased narrative ambition of the fourth game. The story being told was more personal, more emotionally grounded, more focused on a single family's tragedy, rather than the broader institutional horror of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And the minigame format, with its dreamlike quality and emotional directness, was the perfect vessel for that story. Even as the series evolved beyond the original four-game structure, minigames remained a core storytelling tool. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator used simple management gameplay as a frame for its narrative, with the real story emerging through salvage sequences and hidden audio logs. Ultimate custom night embedded story content in the death screens and character dialogues. Each voice line a potential lore clue delivered in the moments after failure. Help Wanted placed Princess Quest, a minigame within a minigame within a game, as the key to understanding Vanny's story and Glitch Trap's escape. The format evolved, but the principle remained constant. The most important story content is the content you have to earn. The story rewards the curious, the persistent, the obsessive. It punishes passivity with ignorance and rewards investigation with revelation. This design philosophy is not accidental. It is a direct product of the franchise's origin in a solo developer working with limited resources. Cawthon could not produce cinematic cutscenes or elaborate scripted sequences. He could, however, create small and self-contained vignettes in a retro pixel style that communicated complex narrative information through imagery and implication. The constraint became the innovation, the limitation became the signature, and the audience fell in love with it, not despite its unconventional nature, but because of it. The minigames of Five Nights at Freddy's are a masterclass in doing more with less, in finding the most powerful storytelling format available within the boundaries of what one person can create alone. In December 2015, something unusual happened in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. A novel was published, not a guidebook, not a companion piece full of character bios and concept art. An actual novel with chapters and dialogue and a protagonist and a plot that moved through scenes the way novels do. It was called The Silver Eyes, co-written by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed Weasley, and it told the story of Charlotte Emily, a 17-year-old returning to her childhood town of Hurricane, Utah, to reunite with old friends and confront the haunted legacy of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The novel featured familiar elements: the animatronics, the murders, William Afton, here operating under the alias Dave Miller, the puppet, the missing children. But it also changed things, sometimes dramatically. Charlie, who in the games is murdered as a young child and possesses the puppet, is alive and well in the book. The timeline is different. The locations are rearranged. Characters who exist only as names on gravestones in the games are walking, talking people with backstories and personalities and relationships. The community was immediately divided. Was this canon? Were these the answers they had been waiting for? Did the events of the novel represent what really happened in the game universe, told from a different angle? Or was this something else entirely? Cawthon addressed this directly, and his answer was one of the most fascinating statements in the history of the franchise. He said the book was canon, just as the games were canon, but then he added a crucial qualifier. He said the two were not intended to fit together like two puzzle pieces. They existed in their own continuities. They shared a universe, or at least a mythology, but they told different versions of that mythology. The events of the novels were true in their own context. The events of the games were true in their context. And the two were not required to agree on every detail. And this is an incredibly unusual position for a franchise creator to take. Most multimedia properties either declare a strict hierarchy of canonicity, where the games override the books which override the films, or they attempt to weave everything into a single coherent timeline. Cawthon did neither. He created a system where multiple versions of the truth coexisted, where contradictions between media were not errors to be resolved, but features of a storytelling approach that valued exploration over consistency. The Silver Eyes trilogy, which continued with the Twisted Ones in 2017 and the Fourth Closet in 2018, told a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. It gave Charlie depth and agency. It explored William Afton as a character with motivations and dialogue, rather than a purple sprite in a minigame. It introduced concepts like the twisted animatronics, illusion discs that alter perception, and the idea that Remnant could be melted from haunted endoskeletons and used to animate new creations. Some of these concepts, particularly Remnant and the melting of endoskeletons, eventually appeared in the games. Others, like the illusion discs and Charlie's specific backstory, remained exclusive to the novels. This created what the FNAF Ultimate Guide would later describe, by saying that many concepts first introduced in the novels later took hold in the games, while concepts in the games were sometimes expanded on in the novels. The relationship was not one of strict adaptation. It was one of cross-pollination. Ideas flowed between media, enriching both without requiring perfect alignment, and the community learned to read the books not as direct answers to game mysteries, but as parallel explorations that illuminated the same themes from different angles. If you wanted to understand the emotional texture of what it meant to be possessed, the novels gave you that. If you wanted to decode the specific sequence of events at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, the games were still your primary source. Neither was the complete picture. Both were pieces of a larger mosaic. Then came Fazbear Frights, and everything got more complicated. Starting in 2019 with Into the Pit, this series of short story anthologies took a dramatically different approach to FNAF storytelling. Each volume contained 3 standalone stories set in the FNAF universe, featuring original characters who encountered animatronic horrors in various settings. A boy who falls through a ball pit into a recreation of the 1985 murders. A girl who makes a dark bargain with a sentient animatronic dog named Fetch. A teenager trapped in a time loop with a homicidal Ella doll. A young man whose body is gradually replaced, part by part, with mechanical components in a grotesque homage to possession narratives. A family whose ventriloquist dummy refuses to remain inanimate. These stories were not direct adaptations of game events. They were variations on FNAF themes, exploring the consequences of Afton's crimes through new lenses and new victims. Each story functioned as a self-contained horror tale, accessible to readers who had never played a FNAF game, while simultaneously embedding details that enrich the understanding of longtime fans. The structure was Cawthon's most ambitious experiment in layered storytelling, a collection that worked on 2 entirely different levels depending on how much context you brought to it. But woven through each volume were epilogue chapters that told a continuous story, and it was in these epilogues that the series revealed its true significance to the broader FNAF narrative. The Stitch Wraith narrative, following an endoskeleton inhabited by the souls of Andrew, a murdered child whose vengeful spirit kept Afton alive on a hospital bed, and Jake, a dying boy who possessed a Simon doll. This ongoing storyline introduced concepts that would prove essential to understanding the games, including the nature of agony as a supernatural force, the distribution center explosion that scattered remnant-infected items across the world, and the mechanics of how emotions could animate inanimate objects. Cawthon himself offered guidance on how to use these books. In a comment that became one of the most cited pieces of FNAF meta-text, he suggested using the novels to fill in the blanks of the game narrative. This phrase, "fill in the blanks," became a philosophical framework for the entire community. It meant the books were not direct transcriptions of game events, but they contained truths that could be extrapolated to explain game mysteries. If the games showed you that remnant existed, but never explained how it worked, the books could fill in that blank. If the games depicted possession, but never explored the emotional experience of a child trapped in metal, the books could fill in that blank. The challenge, of course, was determining which blanks were being filled and which details were specific to the book continuity. A detail about how Remnant behaves might be transferable to the games. A detail about Charlie being a robot built by her father to replace her dead daughter probably was not. The community had to develop a new kind of critical reading skill, not just interpreting evidence, but evaluating which evidence was transferable between continuities and which was locked to its own universe. Tales from the Pizzaplex continued this tradition, starting in 2022, with stories set in and around the Mega Pizzaplex from Security Breach. These volumes introduced the Mimic, an endoskeleton created by Edwin Murray, at Murray's Costume Manor, that could copy the behaviors and movements of anything it observed. The Mimic's origin story, told across these books, became essential to understanding the events of the later games, particularly Help Wanted 2 and the Security Breach Ruin DLC, where a similar entity appears to be the primary antagonist. Without reading the books, players of these games would encounter a bulky, rabbit-like figure emerging from concrete with no context for what it was or why it existed. The books provided that context, not as optional flavor text, but as genuinely load-bearing narrative information that the games assumed you had access to. This evolution represents one of the most debated aspects of FNAF's storytelling approach. On one hand, it creates an extraordinarily rich narrative ecosystem, where each medium contributes unique information that enhances the others. On the other hand, it means that no single medium tells the complete story. You cannot fully understand the games without the books. You cannot fully appreciate the books without the games. And determining which information transfers between them requires a level of interpretive effort that goes far beyond what most franchises demand of their audiences. Over 50 books now exist in the FNAF literary universe, spanning the original trilogy, 12 Fazbear Frights volumes, 8 tales from the Pizzaplex volumes, graphic novel adaptations, interactive novels, guidebooks, and even an in-universe activity book called Ticket to Fun that contains genuine lore implications. The sheer volume of text is staggering, and the community that reads, analyzes, and debates these books has become a scholarly ecosystem unto itself, unparsing sentences for hidden meanings and cross-referencing details across dozens of volumes to construct theories that bridge the gap between page and pixel. Whether this approach is brilliant or maddening depends entirely on your perspective. If you view storytelling as something that should be self-contained within a single medium, the FNAF book problem is a genuine design flaw. Critical information should not require purchasing and reading dozens of supplementary novels. But if you view storytelling as an ongoing dialogue between creator and audience, as a collaborative construction of meaning across multiple platforms, then the book series represents something genuinely innovative. It is a franchise where no single entry point gives you the complete picture, where every medium has something unique to contribute, and where the act of synthesis, of combining information from games and books and films and community discussion, is itself the storytelling experience. The story is not in any one book or any one game. The story is in the space between them. And that space is where the FNAF community has built its home for over a decade. For 7 games spanning 4 years, from Five Nights at Freddy's in August 2014 through Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator in December 2017. The entire franchise was the product of a single developer. Scott Cawthon designed the games. He built the models. He coded the mechanics. He wrote the story. He voiced Phone Guy. He composed the teasers. He managed the community interaction. He decided when to release, what to reveal, and how much to conceal. This arrangement, which would be unsustainable for almost any other franchise of comparable scale, was essential to how the lore functioned. Every detail in a Cawthon-era FNAF game passed through one creative filter. Every hidden message, every source code clue, every pixel in every minigame reflected the vision and intention of a single mind. This meant that the community could treat the games as the output of an individual consciousness, a consciousness they were learning to read, predict, and occasionally outwit. Then Steel Wool Studios entered the picture, and the nature of FNAF storytelling changed fundamentally. The collaboration began when Cawthon approached Steel Wool, an independent VR studio founded by veterans of Pixar, Intel, and Telltale Games in Oakland, California, armed to create a virtual reality adaptation of the original Five Nights at Freddy's. Steel Wool's CEO, Andrew Dayton, who had spent 12 years as a senior technical director at Pixar working on films like The Incredibles and Toy Story 3, led a team that brought expertise in 3D animation and VR design that far exceeded what Cawthon could achieve alone. The initial plan was simple. Take the first game, rebuild it in VR, and let players experience the terror of the security office in full immersion. But early in development, the team realized that a direct translation would not work. Cawthon's original 3D models, designed for static camera angles and limited interaction, looked unconvincing when viewed up close in VR. The stiffness that made them eerie on a flat screen made them look cheap in 3 dimensions. Steelwool redesigned the character models, adding hydraulics, mechanical details, and finer textures that held up under the scrutiny of virtual reality. Cawthon was so impressed with the results that he expanded the project's scope from a single game remake to an anthology covering multiple FNAF titles, plus entirely new content. The result was Five Nights at Freddy's, Help Wanted, released in May 2019, and it was both a technical triumph and a narrative milestone. For the first time, a FNAF game featured A quality production values, fully realized 3D environments, and a level of visual fidelity that made the animatronics genuinely terrifying in ways the original games could only suggest. But Help Wanted also introduced a new layer to the lore. The game's meta-narrative proposed that an in-universe game company had created a VR experience based on the real events at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and that scanning old circuit boards from the original animatronics had accidentally released a malicious digital entity called Glitchtrap. This was a brilliant narrative device because it allowed the franchise to acknowledge its own history while creating a mechanism for its continuation. The old horrors were not over. They had simply migrated to a new medium, and the transition from physical animatronics to digital threats mirrored the real-world transition from Cawthon's solo development to a studio-produced product. Help Wanted worked because it maintained the core FNAF storytelling principles even while expanding the production scale. The lore was still hidden. Cassette tapes containing Tape Girl's warnings were scattered across levels, requiring players to seek them out. These tapes told a story within a story that was remarkably clever in its construction. Tape Girl was a beta tester for the in-universe VR game, and her recordings documented the gradual realization that something malicious was living inside the code. She described how a previous tester named Jeremy had become increasingly erratic, exhibiting disturbing behavior that culminated in self-harm with a paper slicer in the testing room. She described her attempts to quarantine the anomaly by fragmenting the tapes and hiding them across the game's levels, hoping that no one would reassemble them, but knowing that someone eventually would. The tapes were meta-narrative in the purest sense, and they were hidden recordings about the act of hiding recordings, concealed within a game about discovering concealed information, placed there by a character who understood that human curiosity would ultimately overcome every barrier she erected. The Glitchtrap encounter itself was a masterful piece of FNAF design. The entity first appeared as a distant figure, barely visible in the shadows of certain levels, watching the player without interacting. Over the course of the game, as the player collected more tapes and progressed through more levels, Glitchtrap grew closer, more visible, more present. It was not a jump scare. It was not an enemy to be avoided with doors and lights. It was an audience, a witness to your investigation. And in the pizza party level, the game's most disturbing sequence, I recreated William Afton's original murders in VR, placing the player in the perspective of a child being led backstage by a friendly figure in a mascot suit, then trapped, then killed. The player could not prevent it. They could only witness it. And the horror of that helplessness, of watching the franchise's foundational crime unfold from the victim's perspective in full virtual reality, was more effective than any jump scare the series had ever produced. It demonstrated that the transition to VR was not merely a technical upgrade. it was a narrative one. VR allowed FNAF to do something it had never done before, to make you feel physically present in the horror, rather than observing it through a camera feed or a pixel art minigame. The source code conversations on scottgames.com still provided context that the game itself withheld, how Cawthon's narrative voice remained present even as the technical execution was handled by a different team. The community responded with enthusiasm, treating Help Wanted as a legitimate continuation of the saga, rather than a corporate cash-in. Its DLC, The Curse of Dread Bear, added Halloween-themed content that deepened Vanny's character while connecting to Fall Fest events from the franchise's historical lore. Then came Security Breach, and the cracks began to show. Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach was announced in August 2019, the same month as the franchise's 5th anniversary, and promised something the series had never attempted. A free-roaming, open-world survival horror game set in the Mega Pizzaplex, a sprawling entertainment complex filled with the glam rock animatronics. The ambition was enormous. Where previous FNAF games confined the player to a single room or a limited set of cameras, Security Breach would let them physically explore an entire mall-sized structure, hiding in cabinets, crawling through vents, riding go-karts, and interacting with an AI companion in the form of Glamrock Freddy. It was, by every metric, the biggest FNAF game ever conceived, and it was the first major FNAF game released after Cawthon's retirement from public game development in June 2021. Cawthon stepped away following the public disclosure of his political donations, which generated significant controversy within the community. His retirement announcement, posted on his website, expressed gratitude for his career and promised that the franchise would continue under new leadership, while Cawthon remained involved behind the scenes as a producer and story consultant. The day-to-day creative direction shifted to Steel Wool. Security Breach launched on December 16, 2021, after multiple delays attributed to the game's ambitious scope and the challenges of remote development during the pandemic. And it launched in a state that exposed the fundamental tension between FNAF's storytelling DNA and the demands of a large-scale production. The game was riddled with bugs. Animatronics teleported through walls, players fell through floors, missions failed to trigger or repeated endlessly. Performance on PlayStation 4 was, by many accounts, nearly unplayable at launch. Steel Wool acknowledged the issues and began patching immediately, but the damage to the game's reputation was significant. Beyond the technical problems, however, was a deeper narrative concern. The story of Security Breach felt incomplete. Plot threads were introduced and abandoned. Characters appeared without explanation. The multiple endings, rather than providing branching resolutions, felt like fragments of a story that had been assembled from scattered pieces of a larger design that never fully cohered. The burn trap encounter in the basement, which should have been a climactic confrontation with the franchise's enduring villain, felt rushed and underexplained. The game seemed to assume knowledge from the Tales from the Pizzaplex book series that many players did not have, particularly regarding the mimic and its relationship to the entity inhabiting the charging pod beneath the Pizzaplex. This was the fundamental challenge of the Steel Wool transition. Cawthon's solo games were tight, focused experiences where every element served the narrative because one person controlled every element. A single developer making a game in ClickTeam Fusion could ensure that the newspaper clipping in the corner, the phone call on night 3, and the hidden minigame accessed by dying in a specific way all contributed to a unified story. A studio of 20-plus developers building a massive open-world game in Unreal Engine faces a fundamentally different set of constraints. Level designers build environments, programmers implement mechanics, writers draft dialogue, producers manage schedules. And when the schedule compresses, as it inevitably does, the first things to suffer are the subtle narrative details, the hidden messages, the carefully placed environmental clues that defined FNAF's storytelling identity. The Ruin DLC are released free in July 2023, partially addressed these concerns by telling a more focused story centered on a girl named Cassie returning to the abandoned Pizzaplex, guided by what she believes is Gregory's voice, but is actually the mimic using voice replication to manipulate her into freeing it from its concrete prison. This was a tighter, more deliberate narrative that recalled the atmospheric tension of earlier FNAF games, and it demonstrated that the Steel Wool team was capable of delivering a FNAF-caliber storytelling when the scope was controlled. Help Wanted 2, released in December 2023, further refined the approach with its structured minigame format and multiple endings that tied into both the mimic narrative and the lingering threads of Glitchtrap's influence. These later titles showed a studio learning from its mistakes and finding the balance between production ambition and narrative precision. But the transition remains one of the most significant inflection points in the franchise's history. It raised questions that the community continues to debate. Can a story that was defined by the idiosyncratic vision of a single creator survive the delegation to a team? Can the specific quality of hiddenness that made FNAF's lore so compelling be reproduced in a production pipeline designed for efficiency and scale? Can the intimate relationship between creator and audience, the feedback loop that shaped the direction of sequels in real time, persist when the creator is no longer the person making the games? These are not questions unique to FNAF. They arise whenever a beloved indie property transitions to a larger production. But they carry special weight here because the storytelling method itself, the hiding of information, the ambiguity, the reliance on community investigation, was so deeply tied to the conditions of solo development that it may be fundamentally resistant to scaling. The answer, as of today, is complicated. Steel Wool has produced moments of genuine FNAF brilliance. The daycare attendant in Security Breach, with its split sun and moon personality, is one of the most memorable character designs in the franchise. The Princess Quest arcade games, embedded within Help Wanted as a meta-narrative device for freeing Vanny from Glitchtrap's control, are a perfect example of the minigame within a game structure that defines the series. And the visual spectacle of the Mega Pizzaplex, whatever its narrative shortcomings, represents a vision of what FNAF can look like when freed from the technical limitations of a solo developer. But the soul of the franchise, the sense that every pixel matters, that every detail might be a clue, that the creator is playing a game with you as much as you are playing a game with them, that quality is harder to replicate. It belongs to the era of one person working alone in a room in Texas, and it may be the one thing about FNAF storytelling that cannot be manufactured at scale. Before we examine the website itself, it is worth pausing to consider another physical artifact that demonstrated just how far Cawthon was willing to push the boundaries of where a story could live. In December 2017, alongside the release of Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, Scholastic published the official Five Nights at Freddy's Survival Logbook and what appeared to be a simple companion product, a novelty book filled with quizzes, word searches, and casual prompts for the player to fill in, was actually one of the most densely packed lore documents in the entire franchise. The logbook was framed as an employee handbook for a night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, complete with blank pages for logging incidents, drawing suspicious activity, and answering personality quizzes with questions like, "What is your favorite pizza topping?" Innocuous enough on the surface, but scattered throughout the book, in faded red ink that was easy to miss among the bolder black and blue printed text, were messages from a different voice entirely. Someone had written in the margins, and someone who asked questions like, "Do you have dreams?" and "Does he still talk to you?" and "What do you see?" These faded messages, attributed by the community to the spirit of Cassidy inhabiting Golden Freddy, were addressing another presence in the book, one who responded through altered word search answers and circled letters that spelled out fragments like "my name" when decoded. The logbook contained at least 3 distinct layers of communication. The printed employee handbook, which provided workplace tips and in-universe humor. The faded red ink messages from one spirit, asking deeply personal questions of another entity, and the responses, hidden in manipulated puzzles and altered text, that answered those questions in ways that required the reader to physically interact with the book, circling letters, connecting dots, and decoding patterns to extract the hidden conversation. One notable discovery involved running specific pages under blacklight, revealing invisible ink drawings that depicted scenes connected to the crying child's bedroom and the events of the 4th game. The community needed to literally buy a blacklight to read part of the story. This is the logical extreme of FNAF's hidden storytelling philosophy. A physical product that conceals its most important content behind invisible ink, faded margins, altered word searches, and encoded puzzles that demand the reader become an active investigator rather than a passive consumer. The logbook also contained drawings attributed to its fictional owner, sketches of animatronics and nightmare figures that connected to the fear experiments depicted in Sister Location's hidden rooms. A drawing of Nightmare Fredbear, rendered in a casual doodle style, confirmed visual connections between the logbook owner and the underground testing facility, adding evidence to theories about Michael Afton's relationship to the nightmare sequences in the 4th game. The exotic butters notation, a seemingly random reference to a gift basket mentioned in Sister Location, appeared as a casual doodle that the community initially dismissed as a joke before recognizing it as a timeline marker connecting the logbook's owner to specific events. Every page contained potential evidence. Every doodle could be a clue. And the act of reading the logbook transformed from casual entertainment into forensic analysis, with community members photographing every page, enhancing every faded mark, and debating every ambiguous scribble for hidden meaning. This product, a $9 activity book sold in the children's section of bookstores, contained narrative information that the games themselves never provided. It confirmed character identities, established timeline connections, and revealed emotional context that existed nowhere else in the franchise. And it did so through a delivery mechanism that required physical interaction, the manipulation of a real object in real space, extending a FNAF storytelling reach beyond screens entirely. When we talk about how FNAF tells its story through unconventional means, the survival logbook is perhaps the purest expression of that philosophy. It is a story disguised as a toy, a puzzle disguised as a product, and a narrative device that asks you to bring a blacklight to the party. And the community loved it, and because it treated them exactly the way the games did. Not as consumers to be served, but as investigators to be challenged. Most game developers use their websites for press releases, screenshots, and links to buy their products. Scott Cawthon used his website as a storytelling device. scottgames.com, in its original form, was a simple HTML page. No fancy design, no interactive elements, just a background color, an image, and whatever text Cawthon chose to embed. And yet, during the peak years of FNAF's development, this plain web page became one of the most scrutinized pieces of digital real estate on the internet, because Cawthon did not simply post announcements on his website, he performed them. He treated scottgames.com as a stage, a canvas, a message board from another dimension, and the FNAF community treated it as a crime scene and inspecting every pixel for evidence. The tradition began with the teasers for Five Nights at Freddy's 2. Cawthon replaced the default page with a dark image featuring what appeared to be a new animatronic, barely visible against the black background. The community discovered that brightening the image in photo editing software revealed hidden details, text, shapes, and secondary figures concealed in the shadows. This simple technique, hiding information in the darkness of an image and trusting the audience to find it, became Cawthon's signature teasing method. For every subsequent game, the teasers followed the same pattern. A dark image would appear on scottgames.com. The community would brighten it, enhance it, inspect the metadata, check the file name, and examine the HTML source code for hidden messages. And Cawthon would reward their diligence with clues that ranged from cryptic to revelatory. The source code in particular became a narrative channel unto itself. HTML source code is the underlying text that tells a web browser how to display a page. It is not normally visible to the average user, requiring a right-click and view source or similar action to access. Most source code contains nothing more interesting than formatting instructions and image paths, but Cawthon embedded messages in his. During the lead-up to Five Nights at Freddy's, sister location, the source code of scottgames.com and its companion site fnafworld.com contained a conversation between two entities, one speaking from each domain. The exchange unfolded over weeks, with new lines appearing as teasers were updated. From Scott Games came lines like, "You are crowding us, and we found a way to eject you." From FNAF World came responses like, "Be quiet, and you would be lost without me." The community pieced together the conversation in real time, debating who was speaking, what the context was, and how it connected to the upcoming game. This was later understood as a dialogue between the Funtime animatronics and Ennard, reflecting the power struggle that would play out in Sister Location's story. But at the time, it was a puzzle performed across two websites, delivered through a medium that most users would never think to check. It rewarded the exact type of investigative obsession that the games themselves cultivated. If you were the kind of person who checked the source code of a game developer's website, and you were exactly the audience Cawthon was building his franchise for. The technique evolved with each game cycle. For the security breach teasers, the Scott Games source code contained another conversation, this time between what appeared to be Glitch Trap and a new follower. "Stay the course." "I will." "Focus on my voice." "I will." "Don't let anyone lead you astray." "I won't." "Have you selected one?" "I have." This exchange, discovered months before Security Breach's release, provided the first concrete evidence that Vanny's character was being controlled by an external entity, setting up the game's central conflict through nothing more than text, hidden in an HTML file. But the teasers were not limited to hidden text. Cawthon used the images themselves as narrative tools. The infamous "Cancelled Due to Leaks" teaser, and which appeared on scottgames.com during Sister Location's development, initially appeared to be exactly what it said, a message that the game had been cancelled because of leaked information. The community panicked. Then someone brightened the image and discovered additional text revealing it was a ruse, a theatrical fake-out designed to generate exactly the reaction it produced. This was Cawthon playing with his audience in real time, using his website as a stage for a performance that existed entirely outside the games themselves. The map of Circus Baby's entertainment and rental was hidden in the source code of an NR teaser. Release dates were embedded in images that required brightening to read. File names contained character names when opened in a text editor. Invalid color codes in the HTML. I'd like the hexadecimal value 2093, which does not correspond to any actual color, were interpreted as numerical puzzles, with fans subtracting 1 from each digit to arrive at the year 1982 and adding 1 to arrive at 1987, both dates central to the franchise's timeline. Whether Cawthon intended this particular interpretation, or whether the community was reading meaning into a formatting quirk, is impossible to know for certain. But that ambiguity, that delicious uncertainty about whether you are decoding a message or imagining one, is precisely what made the Scott Games experience so compelling. What Cawthon created with his website was a fourth wall that functioned as a narrative membrane. The game existed inside its own fictional universe. The player existed in the real world, and scottgames.com existed in the liminal space between them, a place where the creator could communicate with the audience using the visual and textual language of the game world itself. The teasers were not advertisements. They were lore. The source code messages were not Easter eggs. They were plot points. The website was not separate from the story. It was part of the story. And the act of checking scottgames.com, of brightening images and reading source code and debating file names on Reddit, was itself a form of gameplay. An extended alternate reality game that ran parallel to the actual games, using the internet as its platform and the developer's own website as its primary interface. This approach has no real parallel in mainstream game development. Marketing teams for major studios create elaborate viral campaigns and ARGs to promote their products, but these are typically distinct from the narrative itself. They generate hype. They do not advance the plot. Cawthon's teasers did both. They generated hype and advanced the plot simultaneously. The information discovered in the source code of scottgames.com was not supplementary. It was essential. If you did not know about the glitch trap conversation, you entered security breach with less narrative context than someone who did. If you did not brighten the sister location teasers, you missed maps and character reveals that enriched your understanding of the game. The website was a delivery mechanism for lore that existed nowhere else. And it was free. It was accessible to anyone with an internet connection and the curiosity to right-click and view the source. There was no paywall, no DLC, no premium tier. The most dedicated fans, and the ones who checked the site obsessively and shared their findings with the community, were rewarded with knowledge. And that knowledge became social currency within the fandom. Being the person who discovered a new teaser detail, who noticed a change in the source code, who brightened an image and found the hidden message first, carried genuine prestige. Cawthon had turned his website into a competitive arena for detective work, and the prizes were information and the respect of a community that valued information above all else. The practice has diminished somewhat in the Stillwell era, as the marketing apparatus around FNAF has grown more conventional. Trailers, PlayStation showcases, official social media accounts and press releases have supplemented or replaced the enigmatic one-image teaser, but the legacy of ScottGames.com as a narrative tool endures in the franchise's DNA. It established the principle that FNAF story does not begin when you launch the game and end when you close it. The story is everywhere, in the website, in the books, in the source code, in the community's collective investigation. The game is merely one node in a much larger network of storytelling, and the boundaries of that network are limited only by how far you are willing to look. The story of Five Nights at Freddy's has never been content to stay in one place. From its origins as a point-and-click game built in ClickTeam Fusion, it has migrated across virtually every storytelling medium available, each transition revealing something new about how the narrative functions and testing the limits of its unconventional approach. The most visible of these expansions was the long-gestating film adaptation, a project that spent nearly a decade in development hell before finally reaching screens in October 2023. The film's journey to production is itself a story about the challenges of adapting a FNAF's unique storytelling method to a traditional narrative format. Development began in April 2015, when Warner Brothers acquired the film rights, with Gil Keenan attached as director. The project moved through multiple screenplays, production companies, and creative teams before landing at Blumhouse Productions in 2017, where producer Jason Blum recognized the commercial potential of a horror property with a built-in audience of millions. But finding the right script proved extraordinarily difficult. Cawthon himself later revealed several scrapped approaches on Reddit, including a screenplay based on the Silver Eyes novel, a concept involving a pawn shop where stolen animatronics are brought for resale, and a version centered on the character Cassidy that spanned multiple time periods and tried to incorporate lore from several games simultaneously. Each was rejected because it failed to capture something essential about the FNAF experience. The Silver Eyes approach felt too constrained by its source material and struggled to translate the novel's pacing to a 2-hour film. The pawn shop concept had charm, but felt like an after-school adventure rather than a horror film, losing the claustrophobic dread that defined the games. The Cassidy screenplay tried to cram too much lore into a single narrative, spanning multiple time periods and incorporating details from several games simultaneously, and ended up feeling like a visual encyclopedia rather than a story with emotional stakes. Each failed attempt underscored a fundamental truth about the franchise. FNAF's story was designed to be discovered, not told. Translating that discovery process into a linear film required finding an emotional anchor that could carry a passive audience through events that the games asked players to actively uncover. Cawthon estimated that over a dozen different screenplay approaches were considered and abandoned during the film's 8-year development, a number that reflects both the difficulty of the adaptation challenge and Cawthon's refusal to compromise the franchise's identity for the sake of expedience. Most franchise creators would have accepted a serviceable script and moved on. Cawthon kept rejecting them and waiting for the version that felt right, that captured not just the events of the games, but the experience of playing them. This patience, this willingness to let the project sit in development limbo, rather than release something that missed the mark, is another expression of the same creative philosophy that governs the games themselves. Quality over speed, precision over volume. The right answer eventually, rather than the wrong answer right now. The screenplay that ultimately reached production, co-written by Cawthon, director Emma Tammy, and Seth Cuddeback, took a different approach entirely. It focused on Mike Schmidt, the security guard from the first game, and gave him a personal backstory involving a kidnapped brother that the games never explored. It set the action primarily in the pizzeria, but spent significant time outside it, upbuilding character relationships and emotional stakes that the games, by their nature, could not provide. And it made a deliberate choice to be accessible to newcomers while rewarding longtime fans with Easter eggs, references, and lore nods scattered throughout the set design and dialogue. The result was a film that critics largely dismissed, settling at roughly 25% on Rotten Tomatoes, but audiences embraced with an 87% audience score on the same platform. It opened to $80 million in its first weekend, a record-shattering debut for a horror film released simultaneously in theaters and on Peacock streaming, and went on to earn nearly $300 million worldwide, becoming Blumhouse's highest-grossing film ever. The critical disconnect is revealing, and critics evaluated the film as a standalone horror movie and found it lacking in scares, pacing, and narrative coherence. Audiences, many of them FNAF fans who had waited 8 years for this adaptation, evaluated it as a piece of a larger storytelling ecosystem and found it satisfying precisely because it added new dimensions to characters they already knew. The film did not need to explain the complete history of Fazbear Entertainment because its audience already had that context. It could focus on emotional texture, on what it felt like to work the night shift, on the uncanny quality of being alone with machines that might be watching you, on the grief of a man haunted by family loss. The lore was in the walls, literally. Newspaper clippings, missing children posters, and security notices decorated the pizzeria set, invisible to anyone looking closely, but never explained by the dialogue. The film adopted the franchise's core storytelling principle: hide the important details and let the audience find them, and applied it to a completely different medium. The sequel, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, released in December 2025, continued this approach with a larger budget and expanded scope, introducing new animatronics like the marionette and exploring the origins of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Matthew Lillard, who signed a 3-picture deal for his role as William Afton, described the production team's approach to fan feedback, noting that the sequel aimed to address criticisms of the first film while remaining true to the franchise's core identity. And director Tammy expressed a desire for the film to be special and unexpected, while focusing on what fans wanted, acknowledging the challenge of balancing dense mythology with accessibility for casual viewers. Critical reception remained divided, with some reviewers praising the improved production values, while others criticized the reliance on franchise lore that left newcomers confused. But the box office performance demonstrated continued commercial viability, with the film debuting to over $60 million domestically, setting a record for the highest December horror opening ever at the domestic box office. Beyond the films, the franchise expanded into augmented reality with Five Nights at Freddy's Special Delivery, a mobile game that sent animatronic replicas to hunt players in their real-world environments through AR technology. This was FNAF's version of the location-based gaming trend pioneered by the likes of earlier AR titles, but filtered through the franchise's horror sensibility. The game's narrative framed the AR encounters as a corrupted delivery service, with Glitchtrap's code infecting the programming of animatronic replicas and turning routine deliveries into predatory pursuits. It also featured encrypted communications from Vanessa that revealed her internal struggle against Glitchtrap's control, adding narrative context to the character months before Security Breach would explore her story more fully. The game demonstrated that FNAF's storytelling could function even in an AR framework, hiding lore in emails, voice messages, and encrypted data files that players could discover between encounters. Each medium has demanded a different compromise with the franchise's core storytelling method. The films cannot hide information in source code or require players to die in specific ways to unlock narrative content. They have to tell a story that works as a 2-hour viewing experience while still respecting the franchise's commitment to hidden depth. The AR game cannot replicate the sustained atmosphere of a night shift at Freddy's, but it can create moments of genuine surprise when an animatronic appears in your living room. The books can explore psychological interiority in ways that games and films cannot, giving voice to characters who exist as silent sprites in the games. And the games themselves continue to evolve. From the solo development era's tight, focused experiences to the Steel Wool era's ambitious open-world structures. What unites all of these adaptations is a consistent commitment to the principle that the most important information is the information you have to work for. The films hide lore in set decorations. The books embed transferable concepts in parallel narratives. The AR game buries story in encrypted files. The website conceals messages in source code. And the games, always the games, reward investigation with revelation. No single medium tells the whole story. The story exists in the space between them all, assembled by a community of investigators who have learned to treat every product, every platform, every medium as a potential source of new information. This is not how most franchises operate. Most franchises tell you the story and invite you to enjoy it. NAF hides the story and invites you to find it. And that invitation has proven irresistible across every medium it has touched. We have spent a long time examining the mechanical components of how Five Nights at Freddy's tells its story. The hidden details, the community feedback loops, the retcons, the minigames, the books, the websites, the multimedia adaptations. But there is a deeper question underneath all of these techniques. One that explains why they work so powerfully on a psychological level, rather than just a structural one. Why does hiding the story make it more compelling? Why does ambiguity feel more satisfying than clarity? Why has a franchise built on unanswered questions sustained a devoted community for over a decade, when most stories lose their audiences the moment the central mystery is resolved? And the answer lies in how the human brain processes incomplete information. There is a well-documented cognitive phenomenon known as the Zeigarnik effect, named after the psychologist Bloomer Zeigarnik, who observed in the 1920s that people remember uncompleted tasks better than completed ones. A waiter could recall the details of an unpaid order with perfect accuracy, but would forget the details of a paid order almost immediately. The act of completion, of closure, allows the brain to file information away and move on. But when something remains unfinished, the brain keeps it active, turning it over, prodding it, refusing to let it fade into the background. This is why you cannot stop thinking about a cliffhanger. It is why an unresolved mystery nags at you in a way that a neatly wrapped conclusion never does. The brain treats incomplete information as an open loop, and open loops demand attention. Five Nights at Freddy's is, at its core, a machine for generating open loops. Every game introduces more questions than it answers. Every answered question reveals 3 new ones hiding behind it. The bite of 87 is mentioned in the first game but not shown. When it is apparently depicted in the 4th game, it turns out to be the bite of 83, leaving the original bite of 87 still unexplained. The identity of the crying child is never definitively confirmed. The nature of Golden Freddy shifts between games, sometimes appearing as a ghost, sometimes as a physical suit, sometimes as a vengeful entity keeping Afton alive in an eternal nightmare. Each resolution is partial. Each partial resolution generates new mysteries, and the brain, unconditioned by the Zeigarnik effect to prioritize unfinished business, cannot look away. This is compounded by what psychologists call the generation effect, the finding that information you actively generate or discover yourself is remembered more vividly and valued more highly than information that is passively received. When Phone Guy tells you about the bite of 87, you receive a piece of information. When you discover a hidden newspaper clipping that describes the missing children incident, you have generated a connection between the clipping and the broader narrative. The discovery feels like an achievement because it is one. Your brain processed the visual information, identified it as significant, connected it to existing knowledge, and formed a new understanding. That process of active discovery produces a neurochemical reward and a small burst of satisfaction that passive reception does not. And every hidden detail in a FNAF game is designed to trigger that reward. Every brightened teaser image, every decoded source code message, every missable minigame is a small puzzle that your brain gets to solve. And solving it feels good in a way that being told the answer never quite matches. The community aspect amplifies this effect exponentially. Humans are social creatures, and the act of sharing a discovery with a group activates additional reward pathways. When a community member finds a hidden detail and shares it on Reddit or YouTube, they experience not only the satisfaction of discovery, but the social validation of being the person who found it. The community, in turn, experiences a collective version of the discovery and participating in the excitement, even if they did not find the detail themselves. This creates a positive feedback loop where each discovery drives more investigation, which produces more discoveries, which generates more excitement, which attracts more investigators. The community does not merely consume the story, it participates in the act of constructing the story from scattered evidence, and that participation creates an emotional investment that no amount of passive storytelling could achieve. There is also a principle from horror theory at work here, one that the writer H.P. Lovecraft articulated when he said that the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Five Nights at Freddy's exploits this principle with remarkable consistency. The animatronics are scary, not because they are visually grotesque, though some certainly are, but because you do not fully understand what they are. Are they machines? Are they ghosts? Are they both simultaneously? Is the personality you are encountering the remnant of a murdered child? Or is it the programming of the animatronic? Or is it some hybrid of both that defies categorization? The games never fully answer these questions. They give you enough information to form theories, but not enough to confirm them. And the gap between what you know and what you suspect is where the horror lives. Certainty kills fear. If you knew exactly what Golden Freddy was, it would stop being frightening. It is the uncertainty, the sense that there is something you are not seeing, something just beyond the edge of your understanding, that keeps the fear alive. This is why the franchise's commitment to ambiguity is not a weakness, but its greatest strength. Every unanswered question is a space that the audience's imagination fills with something worse than any definitive answer could provide. When Cawthon leaves the identity of the crying child ambiguous, each player fills that gap with their own version, colored by their own fears and experiences and emotional investments. When the books offer one explanation and the games offer another, the contradiction does not diminish the story. It expands it. Each version occupies a different chamber of the imagination, and the tension between them creates a richness that a single definitive answer would collapse. This is the paradox at the heart of FNAF storytelling. The less it tells you, the more there is to know. The more it withholds, the more invested you become. The story grows larger in the spaces where it is absent, like a shadow that is always bigger than the object casting it. The franchise also benefits from what we might call narrative compounding, the way that each new layer of mystery adds value to all the previous layers. When Five Nights at Freddy's 2 revealed that it was a prequel rather than a sequel, every detail in the first game was suddenly recontextualized. The newspaper clippings, the phone calls, even the layout of the building took on new significance. When Sister Location introduced the concept of remnant, it retroactively enriched the possession mechanics that had been present since the original game. When the Fazbear Frights books introduced agony as a supernatural force, and it provided a framework for understanding events that had previously been attributed to vague spiritual possession. Each new piece of information does not simply add to the pile. It transforms the pile. It causes you to reevaluate everything you thought you knew, to revisit old evidence with new eyes, to discover connections that were invisible before. This is why FNAF theorists can spend hours analyzing games that are over a decade old and still find new things to discuss. The narrative is not static. It is a living system where new inputs continuously generate new outputs from old data. The emotional architecture of the franchise reinforces all of these effects. At its core, FNAF is a story about children. Murdered children. Children trapped in metal shells. Children crying in hallways. Children whose birthdays end in tragedy. In children whose innocence is exploited by adults who should have protected them. This emotional foundation provides the stakes that make all the puzzle-solving matter. You are not just decoding a mystery for intellectual satisfaction. You are trying to understand what happened to these children, trying to give meaning to their suffering, trying to find a resolution that grants them peace. The Happiest Day minigame, where the spirits finally sit at a birthday table and their masks fall away, resonates so deeply not because it is mechanically complex, but because it represents the emotional payoff of hundreds of hours of collective investigation. The community did not just solve the puzzle, they freed the children. And that emotional arc, from horror to investigation to resolution, is what transforms FNAF from an intellectual exercise into something that genuinely moves people. This is why the lore machine works. Not because of any single technique, but because of how all the techniques interact with fundamental aspects of human psychology. Incomplete information creates open loops that demand attention. Active discovery triggers reward pathways that passive reception cannot match. Social sharing amplifies individual satisfaction into collective experience. Ambiguity activates the imagination more powerfully than certainty. Narrative compounding ensures that old content remains perpetually relevant, and an emotional foundation of genuine tragedy provides the stakes that make all the investigation feel meaningful. Cawthon may not have designed this system deliberately, and much of it emerged organically from the constraints of solo development, the feedback of the community, and the happy accidents of a creative process that was making itself up as it went along. But the result is a storytelling engine of extraordinary psychological power, one that has kept millions of people engaged for over a decade and shows no signs of releasing its grip. We have traveled a long way tonight. From a failed Beaver game on Steam Greenlight to a global multimedia franchise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. From a single developer working alone in ClickTeam Fusion to a studio of Pixar veterans building virtual reality experiences. From hidden newspaper clippings in a security office to source code conversations on a developer's website. And from pixelated minigames that lasted 15 seconds to feature films playing on thousands of screens worldwide. And through all of it, through every evolution and expansion and adaptation, the fundamental storytelling engine has remained remarkably consistent. FNAF tells its story by hiding it. That is the thesis. That is the mechanism. That is the secret behind the secret. Everything else, the phone calls, the minigames, the books, the teasers, the community investigations, the retcons, the multimedia expansions, all of it flows from that one principle. The story is not given to you. It is concealed from you. And the act of uncovering it, of piecing together fragments from scattered sources and constructing meaning from deliberate ambiguity, is not a side effect of the storytelling. It is the storytelling. The detective work is not something you do alongside the narrative. The detective work is the narrative. The community that has formed around this franchise is not merely an audience. It is a participant in the ongoing act of constructing a story that no single source, no single game, no single book, no single film can tell on its own. This approach emerged from necessity rather than grand design. Scott Cawthon was a solo developer with limited resources and a background in family-friendly games. He could not produce cinematic cutscenes or elaborate scripted sequences. What he could do was create static images with hidden details, record phone calls with ambiguous information, and build small pixel art vignettes that communicated complex ideas through simple imagery, and the constraints of his situation became the defining features of his art. And when the audience responded to those features with the kind of passionate, obsessive engagement that most developers can only dream of, Cawthon had the creative intelligence to recognize what was happening and lean into it. He did not abandon the hidden storytelling approach when he had the resources to do something more conventional. He doubled down. He made the hiding more elaborate, the puzzles more complex, the ambiguity more layered. He turned his limitations into a philosophy. The philosophy can be summarized in a set of principles that, while never formally articulated by Cawthon himself, emerge clearly from the pattern of his creative decisions over a decade of work. First, the most important information should be the hardest to find. If something matters to the lore, it should not be presented in a cutscene or a dialogue box. It should be hidden in a minigame that requires specific death conditions to access, or buried in the source code of a website, or scattered across the background details of a book that exists in a parallel continuity. Second, questions are more valuable than answers. Every answer should generate new questions. Every resolution should be partial, leaving enough open threads to sustain investigation. Third, the audience is a creative partner, not a passive consumer. Their theories, their debates, their interpretations shape the direction of the narrative. The feedback loop between creator and community is not a side effect of the franchise. It is its circulatory system. Fourth, contradictions are features, not bugs. When two sources disagree, as the disagreement itself is a piece of the story, it invites interpretation, debate, and re-examination. It keeps the narrative alive. Fifth, every medium adds something unique. The games provide the core experience. The books provide psychological depth and transferable concepts. The films provide emotional texture and visual spectacle. The website provides meta-narrative engagement. None is disposable. all are necessary. These principles have proven remarkably durable across over a decade of creative output. They survived the transition from one developer to a studio. They survived the expansion from games to books to films to augmented reality. They survived the creator's retirement from public development. They survived critical dismissals, community controversies, buggy launches, and the inevitable entropy that affects any long-running franchise. The reason they survived is that they are not dependent on any single individual or any single technology. They are a set of storytelling values that can be applied by anyone, in any medium, at any scale. The specific implementation changes. The values persist. Looking ahead from this moment, the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise shows no signs of slowing its restless expansion. The second film opened to strong box office numbers in December 2025, with a 3-picture deal suggesting at least one more installment to come. The book series continues with new interactive novels and graphic adaptations. The Fazbear Fanverse initiative supports fan-developed games that have become official entries in the franchise's extended universe. A themed attraction based on the films is set to appear at Universal Studios. And the community, that vast, passionate, endlessly investigative community, continues to theorize, debate, and discover, turning over every new piece of content for hidden meaning with the same intensity they brought to brightening the first Scott Games teaser over a decade ago. The Secret of the Mimic, fully released in 2025, expanded the franchise's mythology by tying the Mimic endoskeleton's origin story at Murray's Costume Manor directly to Glitchtrap's digital emergence, establishing a through line from the franchise's earliest days to its most recent digital threats. The Into the Pit game adaptation bridged the gap between the Fazbear Frights book series and the game continuity, and bringing literary concepts like the agony-fueled ball pit realm into interactive form. Crossover events, including integration with asymmetric horror games and the Fazbear Fanverse projects, have extended the franchise's reach into new gaming communities, while maintaining the core identity of hidden lore and investigative gameplay. But it is worth pausing to appreciate just how extraordinary this whole experiment has been. In an industry that often treats story as a delivery mechanism for gameplay, or gameplay as a delivery mechanism for story, FNAF has created something where the two are genuinely inseparable. The story is the gameplay. The gameplay is the story. The act of investigating, of searching dark images for hidden text, of dying in specific ways to access minigames, of checking source code and cross-referencing book details and debating timeline inconsistencies on Reddit at 3 a.m, is not a supplementary activity. It is the primary experience. FNAF is not a game you play. It is a mystery you live in. And that mystery has no definitive solution, because the moment it was solved, the moment every question was answered and every ambiguity resolved, the entire edifice would collapse. The open loops would close. The imagination would stop generating possibilities. The community would have nothing left to investigate. The story would be over, not because it reached an ending, but because it ran out of questions. And questions, as we have learned tonight, are the fuel that keeps this extraordinary machine running. There is a quieter lesson in all of this, a one that extends beyond the specific case of Five Nights at Freddy's and speaks to something broader about how stories work in the digital age. We live in an era of information abundance, where every question can be answered with a search query, every mystery can be spoiled with a click, every ambiguity can be resolved by someone who got there first and posted the solution online. In this environment, the act of withholding information has become a radical creative choice. Most entertainment franchises respond to the demand for content by producing more content, by filling every gap and answering every question, and extending every timeline until the narrative collapses under its own weight. FNAF does the opposite. It produces content that creates more gaps, that raises more questions, that deepens the ambiguity rather than resolving it. But it treats the audience's imagination as its most powerful storytelling tool, and gives that imagination room to work by refusing to fill in every detail. In an age of oversaturation, FNAF is a masterclass in the power of restraint. And so, we arrive at the end of this particular exploration. Though the exploration of Five Nights at Freddy's itself never truly ends. The machine keeps running. The teasers keep appearing. The source code keeps changing. The community keeps investigating. And somewhere in the gap between what is shown and what is hidden, between what is confirmed and what is speculated, between what is told and what is discovered, the story continues to grow. It grows in the minds of millions of people who have spent over a decade staring at dark images and finding light in them. And it grows in the arguments between theorists who cannot agree on whether the crying child became Golden Freddy. It grows in the quiet moments when a new player boots up the original game for the first time, sits down in that security office, picks up the phone, and hears a friendly voice say, "Hello, hello, hello." And in that moment, the machine activates. The questions begin. The investigation starts. And the story, the real story, the one that lives not in any game or book or film, but in the space between them all, unfolds once more. Whether you followed every thread tonight, caught a few details that sparked new connections, or simply let the words wash over you as sleep pulled you gently under, thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. The machinery behind the mystery is just as fascinating as the mystery itself. And I hope this journey through the workshop gave you a new appreciation for the extraordinary thing that Scott Cawthon, whether by accident or design, built from the wreckage of a failed Beaver game. Before you drift off entirely, feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this kind of deep, unhurried exploration of how stories work beneath the surface. And let me know in the comments what surprised you most. What detail changed how you think about the franchise? Or what aspect of the storytelling machine you would like us to examine more closely next time? It is always a quiet pleasure to hear from you, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour the clock shows on your wall. Until next time, rest well. The animatronics will keep watch. They always do.